had moved into the neighborhood a little over 2 years ago. It was quiet, safe, and filled with families who mostly kept to themselves. Among them was a Muslim family who lived directly across the street. The mother, Layla, always wore a modest abaya and hijab, often seen walking her 2 young kids to school in the morning. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was soft and composed. We exchanged polite greetings, a nod, a smile, sometimes a good morning or assalamu alaikum from her side. Nothing beyond that. Her husband was barely around. A tall, stoic man with a trimmed beard and serious expression. I saw him maybe once every 2 months, usually leaving in a rush with a suitcase. From what little I gathered through neighbors, he worked abroad and traveled frequently. Layla handled everything alone. School runs, groceries, housework. She was efficient, respectful, and carried a kind of graceful solitude. I didn't think much of her until my own life started to dull. My wife and I had been distant for months. She worked long hours, often came home exhausted, and conversations between us became transactional. The kind of marriage where you speak more through reminders and schedules than emotions. I wasn't seeking anything, not actively at least. But one day, Layla knocked on my door, holding a covered dish in her hands. It was a simple gesture, rice, lamb, and something sweet that tasted like dates. "I made too much," she said, barely holding eye contact. I thanked her and didn't think more of it, but over the next few weeks, the gestures became more frequent. A plate of food, then a short conversation. Question about what kind of work I did. One time she asked if I could help carry a box into her garage. Her eyes always careful, never lingering too long. At first I told myself it was neighborly, normal. But I began to notice the details. She'd wait for moments when her kids were playing in the backyard, when the street was quiet, or when her husband hadn't been seen in weeks. The way she thanked me, it started to carry a heaviness, like she wasn't just being polite. Felt intentional. Then came the note. Slipped under my doormat, written in neat, anxious handwriting. "Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I need to talk. Just talk." No name, but I knew who it was from. I almost ignored it. My heart raced as I read and reread the short message. I wasn't sure if I was flattered or nervous, but curiosity overruled caution. I showed up at her door the next day. She opened it just enough to look at me. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming. I just need someone to talk to. Someone who listens." The moment hung there. Something unspoken passed between us. I didn't realize then how deeply that moment would unravel everything that came after. She started opening up in ways I hadn't expected. What began as small talk shifted into long, unfiltered conversations. She told me about her marriage, how it had turned cold over the years. Her husband had become more religious, more distant. He expected obedience but gave nothing in return. Not time, not affection, not attention. He sent money but emotionally he was absent. She said she hadn't felt like a woman in years. Only a caretaker. I didn't know what to say at first. I wasn't used to someone being that honest, especially someone like her. Layla carried herself with such control, yet behind that calm was a kind of quiet desperation. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't beg for sympathy. But it showed. In the way she looked at me longer than necessary. In the way her voice shook when she mentioned how invisible she felt. It wasn't just what she said. It was how much I looked forward to hearing her say it. I found myself watching for her silhouette through the blinds, waiting for those casual, "Do you have a minute" moments. She began texting me. Nothing scandalous at first. Just simple things. "Did it rain on your side?" Or "Is your power out too?" But the frequency increased, and so did the comfort. There was one message that changed everything. "Sometimes I wonder what it's like to be wanted without conditions." I read it twice. Then again. That wasn't a question. That was a fracture. A door slightly opening. I replied, "You deserve that. Everyone does." She invited me over again. We sat in her kitchen. The kids were at school. Her hands trembled as she poured tea. She looked exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. "I've never said this to anyone before," she said, "but I think I'm losing parts of myself I never knew I had. Every year I feel smaller." She didn't cry, but her eyes stayed fixed on the table, like even looking at me was too much. I said nothing for a while, just sat there, listening. That's all she wanted, or at least that's what I told myself. The conversations grew more intimate. She asked if I had ever been truly happy in my marriage. I hesitated. She noticed. I admitted that things hadn't been right for a long time. That I felt more alone sleeping beside my wife than I did in an empty room. She said, "It's strange, isn't it? Feeling more connected to someone who doesn't belong to you." The line had already been crossed, but neither of us acknowledged it. Not with words, but in the way we stood a little too close. In the long pauses. In the way her fingers brushed mine one afternoon, and she didn't pull away. She just looked at me like she was asking for permission without saying a word. Then she whispered, "I want something that doesn't feel like duty." That wasn't about food or conversation. That was a beginning, and we both knew it. The next time I went over, something was different. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her body language wasn't guarded anymore. There was no tea, no conversation, just silence thick enough to drown in. She closed the door behind me slowly, and I knew neither of us were pretending anymore. There was no planning, no build-up. The air between us had already made the decision. When I touched her hand, she didn't pull back. She looked at me like she was bracing herself for impact. There was nothing romantic about it. It was raw, impulsive, and soaked in guilt before anything even happened. But it did happen. Not loudly, not passionately, but like two people trying to feel something again before it disappeared. Afterward, she sat with her knees pulled close, her eyes empty. I didn't speak. Couldn't. Whatever relief I thought I'd feel wasn't there. It wasn't satisfaction or victory. It was quiet ruin. She looked at me and said, "I don't know who I am right now." We tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but everything had changed. The messages stopped. When I texted, she replied late, short, and distant. I asked if we could talk, and she said she was busy. A week passed. Then two. I didn't see her outside anymore. Then one night she knocked on my door. Her face looked thinner, like she hadn't slept in days. She said, "It was a mistake." He nodded. She added, "It can't happen again." I crossed a line I told myself I never would. Her voice cracked, and she left before I could say anything. The distance grew. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. The silence gnawed at me. I began imagining every worst-case scenario. Did her husband know? Did someone see us? Was she going to tell someone? But it wasn't about exposure. It was about the collapse. She wasn't the same Layla anymore. Her presence, once soft and steady, became cold and mechanical. She walked her kids faster, avoided eye contact, never smiled. Her energy was pulled inward, like she was punishing herself. Her husband returned unexpectedly. I saw his car in the driveway 3 weeks earlier than usual. That night, all the lights in their house were off by 8. Felt like the end of something. Something neither of us would ever speak of again. I told myself we were both adults who made a conscious decision. But that was a lie. It wasn't a decision. It was surrender. We didn't want each other. We wanted what the other person represented. For her it was attention. For me it was escape. The next time we saw each other it was in the grocery store. She turned her head before I could even nod. Walked away like I'd never existed. I stood there, staring at a shelf of cereal, feeling like a ghost. Nothing had been taken from me. But everything felt stolen. She never came back after that day. Not emotionally, not physically. Weeks went by, and the silence between our houses felt louder than anything we'd said to each other. Her presence had vanished from my routine, like she'd erased herself. I stopped expecting to see her outside with her kids. I stopped checking my phone. Eventually, even the guilt settled into something dull. Still there but quieter. Then one morning I noticed the moving truck. Her husband stood outside giving instructions, and the kids were running around, confused but excited. Layla wasn't visible at first, but when she finally stepped out, I barely recognized her. She looked drained, like someone carrying a weight no one else could see. There was no glance in my direction, no hesitation. She moved like someone finishing a chapter, not mourning it. They were gone by noon. I didn't get a goodbye, not that I expected one. She had nothing left to say to me. I stood behind the window long after the truck disappeared, realizing I'd never know why she really left, whether it was guilt, fear, or something else. But in truth, it didn't matter. What mattered was how empty the street felt without the possibility of her walking past. I wish I could say I learned something profound, but the truth is uglier. I didn't fall in love. I didn't even want to ruin anything. I just followed a moment I wasn't strong enough to walk away from. And now, I live in the shadow of that one decision. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No confrontations, no divorces, no consequences that anyone could see. But that's the trap of it. The damage doesn't always show. Every now and then, I catch myself looking for her in passing faces, wondering if she found peace, if she forgave herself, or if she thinks about it the way I do, quietly, shamefully, and only in the spaces where no one else can see. I wonder if she regrets it more than I do, or if she wishes she'd never knocked on my door at all. I never told anyone what happened. Not my wife, not a friend, not even in a journal. It's a memory I carry like a burn, small, hidden, but always sensitive when touched. If anyone had asked, I would have said it was just loneliness. But that word is too soft for what really happened. It wasn't about being alone. It was about being seen, just for a moment, by someone who shouldn't have looked twice. Now I avoid the kitchen around noon. That's when she used to text. I don't open the blinds as often. I've become cautious with kindness, wary of friendly smiles, because I know how fast it can turn into something else. She didn't offer me love, and I didn't offer her salvation. What we gave each other was a moment outside of our lives. Brief, selfish, and unforgettable. Cost nothing at first. But I'm still paying for it, in silence, in guilt, and in the memory of a woman who once needed someone and chose me.